Hello, in this video I'll be showing you how to make gluten-free pizza with a pizza crust from scratch. This gluten-free pizza crust recipe is a yeasted dough, so I always start with preparing my yeast first. I add 1 tablespoon of sugar into a bowl. This will be food for the yeast, and I use active dry yeast, so this sugar will help bloom the yeast and make sure that it works and is living before we add it into the dough. Then I add in 3/4 cup of water. This water needs to be 110 degrees Fahrenheit max. This is hot enough for the yeast to start activating, but not too hot to kill the yeast. If the water's not at 110 degrees Fahrenheit, you can microwave this, and then just check your water with a thermometer to make sure it's at or under 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Then I add in 1 packet of active dry yeast. This is the same as 2 1/4 teaspoons. You could use instant yeast instead of active dry yeast. To do this, you would add the yeast and the sugar in with your dry ingredients like the flour, and add your water in with your wet ingredients like the egg and olive oil. I stir this together and then let it sit for at least 5 minutes. While it's sitting, I prepare my other ingredients. This recipe calls for 2 1/4 cup of gluten-free flour. As always, when measuring gluten-free flour, I pour this into a bowl, and then I'm going to spoon the flour into my measuring device and level the top off. This is a really easy way to get a consistent measurement on your flour as you repeat the recipe time after time. Any flour left over in the bowl you can add back into your flour bag. I add 1 teaspoon of salt and 1/2 teaspoon of garlic powder into the stand mixer. Then I combine these together with the flour. After those are combined, I create a little well in the flour using the back of one of my measuring cups. And then I add in 1 egg at room temperature, 1 tablespoon of olive oil, and 1 teaspoon of apple cider vinegar. By now, a few minutes have passed, and I'll double check on my yeast. You can see here that this is what active dry yeast should look like after you bloom it. It looks like it's grown in size and it's become a lot foamier. So I take this and dump it into my stand mixer. Then I turn on the stand mixer and combine everything together. I let the stand mixer run for at least 3 minutes until the dough starts to look nice and smooth and pull away from the edges of the bowl. One benefit of making a gluten-free flour crust is that you don't have to worry about overdeveloping any gluten and making a tough crust because there's no gluten in here. Sometimes you might need to add a little bit more flour to your dough if it's a little bit sticky or not pulling away from the edges. This can change occasionally just based on how much moisture might have been in the egg that you use. So here I add probably about a tablespoon, maybe a tablespoon and a half extra flour as this is mixing, to get to the consistency that I needed. The dough will still feel sticky, but it shouldn't crumble or fall apart too easily. Everything should stick together as one nice ball. Once the dough is done mixing, I scrape any extras off of the paddle attachment and off the edges of the bowl, and then I turn it out onto a piece of parchment paper. This recipe makes 2 12-inch round pizza crusts, so I split the dough in half. Then I place the dough onto my pizza pan and start working it into the shape of the pizza crust. I like to use these pizza pans that have holes in the bottom because I think it makes a crunchier crust, which I like. So I place this on top of a piece of parchment paper just so that none of the dough is right on the countertop. I spread the dough out working from the center, mostly using my palm, and once it starts sticking to my hands, I put some olive oil on the top. This helps to spread the dough out smoothly, and it also helps when we par-bake the dough before adding any toppings because it gets a nice crust on the top. Once the first pizza crust is formed, I set it aside and make my second pizza crust. I repeat the same process here, starting to smooth out the dough with my hands and then add a little bit of olive oil just to make the smoothing process easier. After we have both of the pizza crusts formed, I'll let these rise. Normally I let the pizza crust rise for at least 30 minutes. I can let it rise up to 40 minutes too, just based on the temperature of the house. The yeast will rise faster in a warmer environment. The rise is really important for this crust because it develops that really nice yeasty flavor, and it also keeps the pizza dough kind of fluffy. This becomes a really nice gluten-free pizza crust because we can get that bottom and the top nice and crunchy, some good texture, but also have a really fluffy inside. This works really well if you're trying to do a thick crust pizza or a thin crust pizza. Once both pizza crusts are fully formed, I cover it loosely with some plastic wrap and let it rise. As I mentioned, I normally let this rise for just about 30 minutes. And you can tell your rise is done when you press into the dough and it leaves an indentation. Now that the rise is done, I take off the plastic wrap and the parchment paper and place the pans in the oven to par bake. I par bake at 425 degrees Fahrenheit for 9 minutes. While the pizzas are in the oven par baking, I prepare my ingredients for the toppings. I realized after I had started making the pizza crust that I only had half a jar of pizza sauce topping, so I decided to make my own to make sure that I had enough for both pizzas. So here I combined 1 8-ounce can of tomato sauce, half a teaspoon of garlic powder, half a teaspoon of oregano, 3/4 teaspoon of basil, half a teaspoon of salt, and a 1/4 teaspoon of sugar. This amount of pizza sauce would be enough to cover one pizza if you like a really thick sauce, or it could cover both pizzas if you like a thinner sauce. But since I have half a jar of pizza sauce, this will be enough for tonight. Once your pizza crusts have baked for 9 minutes, pull them out of the oven and you can do your toppings. You can see the pizza crust on the left, I didn't have enough olive oil on the top, so it cracked a little bit on the top, but the pizza crust on the right has a really nice and smooth finish. So now I build the pizzas up with the toppings that we like. First I'm adding my pizza sauce, and then I add on some mozzarella cheese. I'm making these as supreme pizzas, so I add some thin sliced onions, I add some fresh bell peppers, I add some olive slices, I add fresh cooked sausage, and I top it off with some fresh spinach. Then I place the pizzas back in the oven at 425 degrees Fahrenheit to cook for another 9 minutes. After the pizzas are done cooking, I let them cool just for a minute or two, and then I slice them with my pizza cutter. You could also use a knife here, but if you're going to use a knife, I would recommend taking the pizzas off of their pan and putting them onto a cutting board. And here you can see the final product. This gluten-free pizza crust recipe creates a really great pizza experience with a yeasted dough and a nice crunchy crust. Thanks for watching this video on how to make gluten-free pizza. Let me know how it worked out for you in the comments below, and as always, like and subscribe to see more content.